The Shepnaz Podcast begins now.
Welcome to the Shepnaz Podcast. I'm Joe, and I'm your host today. This past Sunday, we started a new message series here at Shepherd, and we started a series on Daniel. And so today we're in with Pastor Rob. We're going to dive a little deeper into this introduction to the series and kind of take a look into chapter 1 of Daniel. So welcome in.
Well, thank you. Thanks. Good to be here. And love the creative name of this series.
Daniel. Yes.
Yeah. So we were like, there's so many things, you can't just pick one out of it. And so it's like, let's just talk about, make it Daniel, everything connected to him. So there's so much.
There is a whole lot that goes on in that book for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. One of the goals I have as a pastor is I'd love to preach on a series on every book in the Bible. I'm getting older, so I got to get on it because I haven't done all of that because I preached topically for a long time. But the Old Testament books are a little bit more challenging sometimes than the New Testament. Preaching about Jesus is awesome. It's easy and fun. The Old Testament stuff is there's a lot more dig in and a little bit more history and trying to make it relevant. And but Daniel is so rich, and so there's so much in there. So I'm trying to read through the Bible in a year, and I'm on, I think, month 19. So
Nice.
I didn't get it done in a year, but I'm close. But I'm on Daniel.
While you were saying this, I was doing some quick math in my head, and I was like, okay, well, 66 books. If you did one book per month, you got 5.5 years worth of content there. So
yeah, that's just a like 4-week series, and some of these are like you try to do the book of Revelation in 1 month, so yeah, I got some under my belt, but then you sometimes, depending on what's going on in the world, in the church, you go back and you cover some things maybe you've covered before. So, because the word's always dynamic and applying to different situations. So, yeah. So anyway, the book of Daniel, I'm really excited about it. And if you maybe didn't know, Daniel is the one who authored the book. He is the one who wrote it. But it's interesting that he wrote the book near the end of his lifetime. He lived to be into his 80s. And so a lot of the stuff that we talk about and what we'll talk about today for sure, he was a teenager when it happened. So, it's a book that isn't, it's got some things to say to young people as well. And interestingly, most of the New Testament books were written in Greek, and most of the Old Testament books were written in Hebrew. But the book of Daniel is written in 2 languages, which is Aramaic, which is a version of Greek kind of, and then Hebrew. And the first, like chapter 1 that we're going to deal with today was written in Hebrew because it was dealing mostly with the Jewish people. And then in chapter 2, we pick up, Daniel's interpreting dreams for the Babylonian kings and all these other things. And that's all written in Aramaic, which is kind of like Greek, but not. Mm-hmm. But it was the contemporary language of the international business at the time. So when Daniel wrote it, it was everyone could read that. It wasn't just specifically to the Jewish people. And then he went back at the end of chapter 7 and went back to Hebrew because that pertained mostly to the Jewish people again. And the book of Daniel's got a lot of prophetic things in it. So we're probably not going to dive too deep into the prophetic stuff because it's, there's a verse, I think it's in chapter 7 somewhere, where Daniel wrote everything down. And then he says, I was just wore out writing it down because he didn't even understand it. Like even the angel, he's like, I'm writing what you tell me to write. I'm writing what I see. But what all does it mean? And the angel says, seal this up for later. It's about the end and you're not going to know. But it's really interesting because the stuff that Daniel writes about is connected specifically to the book of Revelation. So like when we think about the book of Revelation in the Old Testament or in the New Testament, the book of Daniel is to the Old Testament what Revelation is to the New Testament. So and they both feed off of each other. Jesus quoted stuff from the book of Daniel. And interestingly, in Daniel chapter 11 alone, just in chapter 11 of Daniel, there are over 100 prophecies that have been fulfilled.
Wow.
And it's mind-boggling. And like you could not cover all of that stuff in, if you wanted to be in detail and really dive in, it would be, he could preach on that book for a year. I mean, it's crazy. So we're not going to dive into all the prophetic stuff as much. There's some stuff in there that we'll talk about, but mostly we're talking about Daniel and his life and what God did in his life and some of the experiences that he had and how they're similar to really the culture that we live in today, really.
Well, it's amazing, even when you're talking about just the mechanics of how it was written, and it's totally beyond me that I would sit down to write something and I would write it in the language of the audience that it's most likely to be targeted towards.
Yeah.
That's just a phenomenal concept that's beyond me.
Daniel was brilliant. I mean, he was a very wise person, and he was not only learned in the Jewish culture, but as we'll see, he was kidnapped and taken to Babylon and brainwashed. They tried to brainwash him, I should say. He didn't get brainwashed, but he did learn all about the Babylonian culture as well. And so he's a smart person. So let's dive in. I'll just read we're just going to read the first chapter, part of the first chapter, and share it. So this kind of gives a little bit of context for what we're talking about. And I think it's really interesting. So, it begins in Daniel chapter 1, verse 1, says, "In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles of the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasury, in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah: Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, he gave the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah, Shadrach, to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and the wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel, but the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord, the king, who has assigned you your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard, whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and then treat your servants in accordance with what you see." So he agreed to this test, and it tested them for 10 days. At the end of the 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the young men who ate the royal food. So the guard took away their choice food and the wine they were to drink and gave them vegetables instead. Daniel and I would just not agree with that at all. Verse 17 says, "To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with them and found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they entered the king's service, and in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which he questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom." So that's the first. That's kind of the intro. That kind of sets the stage for all the other things that kind of happen. And I want to kind of set this up a little bit. And the last time that I preached, we were preaching about Jesus going to Samaria, and we talked about this this feud that existed between the Samaritans and the Jewish people. Excuse me. We talked about where it came from. So this is interesting how this plays into the life of Daniel. So if you remember, the northern kingdom was invaded by the northern kingdom of Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms, northern and southern. The northern kingdom was invaded by Assyria, and then Assyria took the citizens out and then brought in their own people.
Right.
But there were some Jews that remained, and those Jews began to intermarry with the foreigners, and they became the Samaritans. And so the Jews in the southern kingdom thought, they're not real Jews because they've lost their racial purity. But the Samaritans said, no, we are Jews still, but that's where the feud came from. So the Jews and Samaritans didn't like each other because the Jews wouldn't recognize the Samaritans as Jews, and the Samaritans were mad because the Jews wouldn't recognize them. So that's where that happened. So that all happened in the northern kingdom. But less than 100 years after that happened, there was an invasion of the southern kingdom. And the invasion in the southern kingdom came from none other than Nebuchadnezzar.
Yeah.
And Daniel was living in the southern kingdom when all of this happened. And so what happened, the history tells us that Nebuchadnezzar decided he was going to tax everybody who lived in his kingdom, and he felt like the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah, was in his kingdom, and he decided to tax them. And the king says, no, we're not in your kingdom, and we're not paying your taxes. So the king's like, oh, yes, you are. And he invaded them. And because of the sin in the southern kingdom, what happened was God gave them over to Nebuchadnezzar. It was a judgment for their sinfulness. But that's historically kind of what all happened there. And so what happens is Nebuchadnezzar comes in. He totally takes over the southern kingdom. They deport lots of the Jews, and then they import some of their people. But there was a custom back then that what they would do is they would deport the finest citizens from a country that they went into, and then they would train them for service in their own government. So this is exactly what's happening. So Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as they will become named, were exported or deported or exiled from the southern kingdom, taken to Babylon, where Nebuchadnezzar was king, and then they were brainwashed.
Join us for Worship Night at Shepherd Church Johnstown campus on Sunday, August 11th at 6 p.m. Experience an evening of powerful worship and uplifting music where we will encounter God's presence. Bring your family, bring your friends, and let's come together to celebrate and connect. Shepherd Church in Johnstown is located at 280 South Main Street, Johnstown, Ohio. We hope to see you on Sunday, August 11th at 6 p.m.
So this is where we pick this up, where it says in the first chapter here, Nebuchadnezzar invades the southern kingdom, and Daniel and his three friends are kidnapped, and they're taken to Babylon to be brainwashed. The motive, the reason that they were doing this is because there were now a lot of Jews living in Babylon, and the king needed to have some people who had influence to help the Jewish people walk away from their Jewish heritage and accept the Babylonian heritage and culture, thus making the conquest complete. They would become Babylonians.
Right.
And so, they're not, all the Jews that were exiled weren't going to listen to Nebuchadnezzar, but if they found somebody who was influential in Judah in the beginning, they would say, well, maybe, we'll do that. That's what they were doing with Daniel. So they kidnapped him and his friends. They took him into Babylon, and they're gonna do all this stuff to them, right? They're gonna try to conform them to the new belief system of the Babylonians. The problem here, and this is the tension in the story, because every story has to have tension, right? The tension is that the Babylonian culture and religious beliefs stood in stark contrast to the Jewish culture and religious system. So the Babylonians were a polytheistic culture, which meant they worshiped many gods. They had a god for everything. One place I read said there was about 2,100 different gods that the Babylonians had.
Wow.
So, you had every god controlled a different thing. So you had a god for the weather, and a god for fertility, and a god for happiness, and a god for war, all these kind of things. So kind of sounds a little bit like Hinduism, but it's a polytheistic religion. The Jewish people, however, on the other hand, were monotheistic. They believed that there was one God. In fact, every day the Jewish people would repeat the Shema, which said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." God's Word version says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is the only God," right? And so Nebuchadnezzar's plan is to take an entire nation of people who get up every morning and chant this over and over again, that there's only one God, and somehow get them to believe in the Babylonian culture and all that. So how do you get an entire nation of people to stop believing something they believe for generations? Well, you try to find somebody who's influential in their culture, and you try to brainwash that person, and you try to let them become your representative. And so that's what's happening with Daniel. Now there's more. It's not just Daniel. And then there's his three friends. There's others, but this story is about Daniel and his three friends. So what they do is they take them and they literally start to brainwash them, right? So there are four things that I've noticed in Scripture that they did. First thing was that if you're going to do some brainwashing, here's how you can do it, all right? You learned it on the Shepnaz podcast.
How-to guide.
Yes. The first thing is isolation. So that's what they did. So they take these guys, remove them from their family, remove them from their homeland, remove them from all their friends, all the things that they had always had and known, and they just isolated them, right? And also remember that Daniel is a teenager. Most theologians think he's somewhere between the age of 13 and 16 when this happens. So very impressionable, very committed to his family, still living with his family. All that stuff has happened. So obviously this would have been a traumatic shock to their system and throwing their world into a complete tailspin. They would be vulnerable, isolated, separated from everything that's familiar with them, which makes a person far more susceptible to new ideas. They're thinking, the Babylonians think this would increase the likelihood of their deconversion from their faith in the Lord God and their conversion to the worldview of Babylon. And we hear a lot today about deconversion, about deconstructing our faith and everything. And this is a part of, at least for the Babylonians, it was a part of the brainwashing system. So they isolate them. Then there's indoctrination. And so what they basically did was they immersed these four guys and all the others who were this was happening to as well, into the Babylonian culture for 3 years. Like verse 4 says that the official was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. And so it would begin immediately, and it was unlike anything they really had ever known. They were immersed in the Babylonian language. They had to speak the Babylonian language, the philosophy, the literature, the science, the history, and the astrology. They were learning everything about the Babylonian worldview, which included their view of man, their view of God, their view of sin, what redemption was like. And all of those things were directly opposed to what they had learned in Judea when they were young men, right? Everything. Religion would have been a big part of that. And so, in all of art and literature, it's very religious. Art is telling stories. The literature is telling stories. And it's all teaching worldviews. And so these guys would have been subjected to the mythologies of Babylon, the greatness of Marduk, their god, who was the primary god of the pantheon of the many gods. And then all of these different polytheistic deities that dominated the ancient Near Eastern world. They would have learned about dreams and interpretations and omens and omen reading and divination and astrology. All of those would have been on their required course load. Like that's their syllabus, right? I mean, they go from being in Judea with their families, loving God, waking up every morning, repeating the Shema, that there's one God, and then they're being just immersed in this culture that just is trying to undo all of that. And they're 13, I mean, they're impressionable and it's amazing.
And it's evil, but it's a brilliant strategy.
Yeah.
Because if I was trying to conquer and convert a people, I have to be worried about the people that can fight against me. And so if I get all the young men on my team, well, then the rest of the cultures just have to fall in line because there's no one to fight me.
Yeah.
It's... I can see, and of course, in my head, I can't help but start to drawing parallels. I can almost see where you're going to be heading with this.
Yeah. Well, and it is very similar to the culture that we live in. I mean, we're not kidnapping kids, but we are doing the same stuff in our culture. So you've got isolation, and then you've got indoctrination, and then there's this assimilation. That's the next step. And the goal of assimilation is not just to change their minds, but to change their lifestyle. Like we want them to experience a lifestyle. So each of the young men that they were doing this to, including Daniel and his 3 friends, would eat like a Babylonian and drink like a Babylonian, and that would and they were getting nothing but the best. I mean, they weren't seeing the crumbs off from the table. They were getting the best stuff, and because they're trying to sell these guys on this culture, right?
It's part of the pitch.
Yeah, so they're getting all this. So they're enticing them with the delicacies and the privileges of their new life, and basically the idea is to eventually wear them down and win them over. It's like, this isn't that bad, It's it's like, man, I'm eating great food, I'm drinking good stuff, and I'm living in a plush place. And like, what am I griping about? And for a lot of those guys, probably they did turn, but as we'll read, Daniel had something different. And then the last thing was confusion. So we got isolation, indoctrination, assimilation, and confusion. And basically the goal was to make them forget who they were and to embrace this new identity. One of the ways they did that, this is really interesting. In verse 7, it says that the chief official gave each of them new names, right? So they all come in with their names. And in the Jewish culture, you probably remember, in the Eastern culture for sure, is that names are significant. They mean something. They are, they are tied to your identity, your character. They're tied to sometimes destiny and goals and plans in life. And so to replace a person's name is to change their identity. And so they changed their names, Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They changed their names. So Daniel's name was, it meant Elohim is my judge. Elohim is one of the names for God. So basically his name, Daniel, meant God is my judge. So they changed his name to Belteshazzar, which means may Bel protect his life. And Bel was one of the polytheistic gods. So they took these guys who all are named after God, have something, God is something, and they changed it to one of their other gods. Hananiah meant Yahweh is gracious, and they changed Hananiah's name to Shadrach, which means Aku is exalted. Aku is one of their gods. So every time you say your friend's name, you're saying, you're praising a Babylonian god. Mishael, which meant who is what Elohim is, was changed to Meshach, meaning who is what Aku is. So they just replaced that. And Azariah meant Yahweh is my helper, and his name was changed to Abednego, which means the servant of Nebo, which is one of the Babylonian gods. So what happens is they strip their identity. Right? They're like, not only are you no longer in your home, not only are you reading your scripture anymore, you're reading our stuff, seeing our stuff, eating our stuff, living our stuff, and we're not even calling you who you used to be, giving you these new names, right? And all these names were reflections of the new gods that they wanted them to serve. And so like we can read a few verses in Daniel and think, oh, this is a really bad thing to happen to these guys. This was a 3-year program. Right, so they're immersed in it for 3 years. Like we think about, maybe something that maybe helps us to think about it in terms of today's. We hear about the terrorist organizations and what they do and how they do things to people and try to brainwash them or whatever. I mean, this is what's happening. This is like a big full scale onslaught of these guys trying to change who they were and help them to embrace this Babylonian culture. And no doubt, I'm sure that there are many of those young men who were taken, became leaders, for the Babylonians and stuff.
Well, I was thinking, maybe something we could relate to in our culture. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that would be relatable. Is you think about when somebody volunteers to go to the military and they go through boot camp, and you have a very intensive period of time in which they want to change the way you think, so that you will follow the commands and that you will kind of align yourself with the way the military wants to run, and. You do that, in 6 weeks or a couple months?
8-9 weeks.
In a few months. And yet this is like a 3-year boot camp to really get it
24/7.
ingrained in them.
Yeah. That's a great analogy. Because that's what they do in boot camps. They break you down, and then they build you back up the way they want you to be. And that's exactly what they're doing. They're breaking these guys down, brainwashing them, getting rid of everything that they thought, and they're like, this is now the new you. This is who you are. And they're giving them everything that they'd ever want. So that's kind of like a big deal. I mean, it's like, we've read the story of Daniel. We're like, this is too bad this happened to these guys. This was 24/7, 3 years.
Yeah.
And it was intense, and it was evil. I mean, what they were doing to these guys was evil. So I think that's probably a good place to stop, and then we can talk about how to beat being brainwashed next week or tomorrow.
Good. So tomorrow, we aren't going to just leave you in this spot where they're potentially being brainwashed.
There's great news for you today.
There is ways to overcome that. And so be sure to share this message with others so that they can not only get this part of it, but get tomorrow's part of it as well. You can follow everything that's going on at the church by going to shepnaz.org. Also, we encourage you to go to YouTube, Facebook, and Instagram and see what we have there as well. For Pastor Rob, I'm Joe. Have a great day. This podcast is a production of the Shepherd Church of the Nazarene, Gahanna, Ohio. Email to podcast@shepnaz.org and let us know what you think.